Welcome to staff, Mark, Ike and Brent, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, We'll start with a very short summary of some of the process and legal issues. This is, as you know, the second decision-making meeting that the Council has had in relation to deciding on the substance of the IHP recommendations. What the staff presentation does is address the first 4 bullet points there as being legal matters, and then passing on to a description of the substance of the IHP recommendations and the substance of any alternative recommendations that are being proposed by the Mayor or councillors. So first we're going to provide a short guidance on decision making, very similar to one we have spoken about a number of times before. We'll highlight the duty to make a decision on either accepting or rejecting IHP recommendations. We'll summarise the relationship between this and Plan Change 13. And then I'll be passing on to Ike and Mark to talk about the substance of the IHP recommendations. Now, you've seen this slide before, councillors. What this is showing is where we are at in a statutory to quasi-judicial decision-making process. The yellow around boxes indicates where the community engagement happens in this quasi-judicial process. So there was community engagement in drafting the plan change. When it was notified, there were submissions, there was community engagement in a hearing, and there will be community engagement again if and when central government decides to change the law to make medium density residential standards optional next year. There will be a bill and presumably submissions on that. This is not a point in the process at which there is any community engagement. Your relevant considerations are solely those, as the Mayor has said, in the IHP recommendations, in the IHP subsequent clarifications of its recommendations, and all the information and material that was available to the IHP. They are your sole considerations. Now, when you make a decision today on either accepting or rejecting an IHP recommendation, if you accept the IHP recommendation, that's the end of the process. That means the district plan will now be changed. If you reject the IHP recommendation and send it must go to the Minister to make a decision. And as the Mayor has said, if you reject an IHP recommendation without proposing an alternative recommendation yourself, you're losing an opportunity to try and influence the Minister's decision. And once the Minister does make a decision, then it will be final.
You done?
Part of the reason...
That was quick.
Roughly 9 slides, Mayor, on the legal stuff, and then we'll pass on to the substantive stuff. This shows you or reminds you of the number of information sessions and information packages you have had with council officers so far, and the information that has been collated for you on particular topics that you have raised as being of interest. Usual advice to any council making a decision still applies. Keep an open mind. Do not have anything predetermined before the debate in this session. Have regard to all relevant information, disregard irrelevant information, and ensure you're fully informed. Now that mention of being fully informed applies equally to any alternative recommendations that staff do not yet know about that anyone might be thinking about raising today. So in order to be fully informed, the staff have been working with councillors over several months. If councillors have raised any alternative proposals to help the councillors identify all relevant parts of the IHP information that is relevant to your alternative proposal. So there are big risks if you raise anything new today without having gone through the same process. Specific guidance for decision making on this plan change. So as the Mayor has said in his opening, the sole relevant matters you can consider are the IHP materials, the notified plan change and reports, submissions, reports to the IHP, reports by the IHP, evidence and submissions to the IHP memos and minutes, and the IHP recording. So this is the same. This is our summary of all the information that officers have provided to you. You have to consider, if you're when you're making a decision, all relevant information on the topic, not selective reading. As the Mayor has said, you can't consider anything that wasn't before the IHP. So that includes communications from anyone, any articles you've read in the newspaper, any letters to the editor, any social media, any placards. And as we've said several times also, the way the RMA provisions are written for this particular plan change, staff can't express opinions. Staff cannot advise you on the merits of the IHP recommendations or the merits of your alternative recommendations. Now, there is one exception to that, which Ike will describe, and that concerns what officers consider to be an inconsistency in the IHP recommendations, which came out of a minute that the IHP issued, I think, just a week ago. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And there is a judicial review risk for the council and possibly damages claims if council decision-making breaches these rules of good decision-making. And that risk is, not least, further delay and uncertainty for the community on top of everything else. As the Mayor has said, the RMA requires the council to make a decision on the IHP recommendations. It requires the council to either accept or reject every recommendation. Now, the Act doesn't require the council to propose an alternative recommendation to the minister if the council does reject an IHP recommendation. The council has an option to propose an alternative recommendation to the minister. But the officer advice to you is that the council is losing an opportunity to try and influence the minister's decision-making if it is not proposing an alternative, that there's nothing to be achieved by simply rejecting an IHP recommendation and not proposing something different to the minister. Council officers have put a great deal of work into identifying submissions or part of the IHP record that's relevant to any alternative proposals that are being put forward by councillors today. And the way we've summarised there is that alternative recommendations have been tied to submission points. And so that's why I emphasised earlier on that making a decision today that isn't tied to submission points or evidence increases the risk of the minister rejecting the council's alternative and increases judicial review risk. So if there is to be, and we hope there's not a great deal, but if there are to be any alternative recommendations raised today that officers don't really know about, we'll be saying let's not deal with that on the fly during the meeting because that creates risk. Let's adjourn the meeting, give officers the time to work with the mayor or the councillors if there are those alternatives being raised, and then come back together to deal with it in a more fully informed sort of way. Any IHP recommendation that you reject, this is simply summarising what the RMA says. Any IHP recommendation that you reject has to be decided by the minister. The minister will consider the same material that you've considered together with any reasons that you set out for rejecting the IHP recommendation. If you do propose an alternative, it will go off to the minister together with a description of the reasons for that alternative. What we don't know is what will happen if the minister is thinking about a IHP recommendation that council rejects, but council doesn't state an alternative for the minister to consider. We don't know what the scope of the minister's decision-making will be on that. It's not totally clear. But hopefully we don't have to advise you on that, because, as I've said, officers are very firmly advising that if you are rejecting an IHP recommendation, make sure you're proposing an alternative for the Minister. In the last information session, it was clear that we weren't being very clear about the relationship between Plan Change 13 and Plan Change 14, and so the purpose of this slide is to try and clarify that a little bit more. Plan Change 13 on heritage matters was notified at roughly the same time as Plan Change 14. It had been drafted before Plan Change 14, but it was notified around the same time. Now, there are things called residential heritage areas that the council included in Plan Change 14 and are also included in Plan Change 13, together with all other heritage matters. Your decision making today will be deciding whether to accept IHP recommendations to remove residential heritage areas from Plan Change 14. So you'll be making that decision today. Now, that decision doesn't change Plan Change 13. That's a separate plan change going through its own separate legal process. So if, for example, you decide to accept the IHP recommendation and remove residential heritage areas from Plan Change 14, they are still existing in Plan Change 13 as a proposed change to the district plan. So people will still be constrained from the type of activity that the rules for residential heritage areas constrain, even though you've made that decision in PC 14. So what you will need to think about when an officer report comes back to you in, I think, a week's time, Mark, on Plan Change 13, you'll need to decide on Plan Change 13 whether you're going to continue with residential heritage areas in that or whether you're going to withdraw them. So it doesn't matter whether you accept or reject the IHP recommendation on PC 14, these residential heritage areas will still exist in PC 13 unless you decide to take them out. Now, there will be pros and cons of having inconsistent decision-making between PC 14 and PC 13. And the staff report coming back to you in a week's time about PC 13 will talk about that. But just as an example, you might think that for purely pragmatic reasons, because the IHP has said that the council didn't adduce sufficient evidence to justify residential heritage areas in PC 14, you might think, well, there's no point in opposing the IHP recommendation in PC 14. We'll deal with that by continuing with PC 13 and beefing up the evidence. So that's one example. Another example might be that you fully accept the reasoning of the IHP in rejecting residential heritage areas in PC 14, and you accept their recommendations in that, and you make the same decision in PC 13 by discontinuing residential heritage areas. So for that reason, we've said here that in this slide that for the purpose of staff writing a report for you on PC 13 next week, it would be great if you can indicate the reasons for your decisions today on residential heritage areas in PC 14. So you'll be telling us whether you are intending to, at this stage, subject to what you see in the staff report, whether you're intending to keep residential heritage areas in PC 13 or whether you're intending to take them out of that as well. We can come back to that. It's an awfully confusing one. We'll come back to that if you want. Now we've got 2 slides here just summarising a High Court decision in what we've been calling the Waikanai case, because that's an important part or an important influence on the IHP recommendations to you. Pretty briefly, PC 14 included rules that constrain development more than does the operative plan. And that's because prior to a High Court decision that came out in June of this year, it wasn't clear whether those types of rules were authorised by the RMA or not. It was the council view, based on legal advice to the council, that Plan Change 14 could introduce rules that constrained existing development in the operative plan. After the IHP hearing closed, so that means after the last point at which anyone, including the council, could have any influence on the IHP decision making, the High Court issued its decision in what we're calling the Waikanai case. And that decision was that this type of plan change for this sort of process cannot introduce rules that constrain development more than does the operative plan. And that High Court decision has had an influence on some big parts of the IHP recommendation. This council needs to follow that IHP decision, needs to apply it. It would be unlawful to depart from that approach to the interpretation of the RMA. And with thanks to one of my colleagues, Ms. Appleyard, who was involved in the IHP process, here is a tidy way of trying to explain what the High Court decision in Waikanai does. What it does is say that rules in this type of plan change, where they are talking about things like qualifying matters, they're limiting the development that would otherwise be enabled by this plan change. So that's the yellow bit in that wee graph. What they can't do, says the High Court, is limit existing development rights under the operative plan. And that's broadly the end of the legal component of this presentation. Thank you. Passing to you.
Thanks, Brent. So as shown on the slide there, no doubt you're familiar that there are a number of alternative recommendations that have been put forward, 21 in total. They're just listed there on the slide for reference. I won't be going through all of those, but as Brent has alluded to, they will be subject to the Minister's approval in due course, should they succeed today as well. In terms of the scope of what the Plan Change 14 decision is for today, at a commercial level, it is all of the commercial centre zone. So it is the balance of the city centre, which was in part decided on the 18th of September, and all of the suburban centres surrounding that throughout the urban area, including also the commercial Banks Peninsula zoning for Littleton, and also the large format retail zone being proposed as well. In terms of residential, there are medium and high density residential zones that is part of the Plan Change 14 Policy 3 element, including residential suburban and residential suburban density transition and coastal environments, which is a response to the qualifying matter approach to retain operative zoning where there is a sufficient overlap in terms of mitigating that risk. So qualifying matters in terms of restricting any intensification are very much part of this decision making within those Policy 3 environments as well. We also have specific purpose or other zones, and that is principally as a result of the catchment approach for Policy 3. Policy 3 is fundamentally about intensification within those commercial centres and surrounds. Walking catchments is the approach that has been recommended by the hearings panel, and in doing so, all of the zones that fall within that catchment are part of this decision on Policy 3. So it includes those school sites, hospital sites, tertiary education and the like as well, and possibly through mixed use as well through an alternative recommendation near the city centre. It's worthwhile to note that all of the accepted IHP recommendations are treated as operative from the notification of decision, which we intend to be the 12th of December. What that means is effectively that they override what is in the operative district plan as of today. Including that, all of the councillor alternative recommendations have legal effect as well from the notification of decision. That is our most recent advice that we've received, and that's important to recognise considering the scope of alternatives that we have before you today. In terms of the fundamental approach of Policy 3, like you'll know, the city centre really in reality has no height limit, and so again today's decision is about the balance of the city centre zone of what hadn't been considered on the 18th of September. Surrounding that, we have the residential high density area, which has a central city residential precinct, which enables buildings up to 39 metres or about 12 stories. And then beyond that, other high density areas are enabled to 22 metres within the 4 avenues, or otherwise 14 metres around those larger suburban commercial areas. Those suburban commercial areas are made up of town, local and neighbourhood centres, town being the largest, and then local and neighbourhood beneath those. Town has been split into 2 larger town centres, the Hornby, Riccarton and Papanui, enabled to 32 metres or about 10 stories, and the remaining to 22 metres or about 6 stories. Local centre zones, most of those are at 14 metres. We have Littleton Centre at 12 metres as well, considering the qualified matter of heritage for that centre as well. And the neighbourhood is at 14. And then surrounding some centres, we also have medium density zoning, which the IHP has recommended around specific local centres within a 200 metre catchment, and that is 12 metres in practice in terms of development under the medium density zone. The centres framework that exists in the district plan is built on a hierarchy as follows on the left there in terms of table 15.1. The exercise that Plan Change 14 went through is to effectively translate that hierarchy to what's called the National Planning Standards. And so the main point here is that the position within that hierarchy that exists within the district plan is fundamentally unchanged. The names have changed accordingly, and in some cases the level of intensification within those centres have also changed. That degree of intensification is as follows. So like I said, we have town centres split into larger and then normal town centres, and then they're split accordingly in terms of the heights. And then larger local centres, which is also to 6 stories or 22 metres, and then those specific local centres. It's those specific local centres where there is the Policy 3 approach that the hearings panel has identified within a 200 metre walking catchment, which includes the medium density, which is the MDRS component of that as well. Neighbourhood centres are simply enabled to 14 metres in height, and there is no intensification around those centres as recommended by the hearings panel. In terms of the 2 zones, from a residential perspective, really high density on the left there is incorporated within all commercial centres of 22 metres or greater, except for North Hallswell, which is simply just enabled to medium density within the balance of the outline development plan area, and the Ferry Mead Centre, and that's a function of the qualifying matters, the coastal hazards surrounding that centre. And so in that instance, for the most part, the operative zoning is held around that centre. Walking catchments, like I said, have been used to delineate the Policy 3 approach, and for high density zoning, that is between 400 metres and 800 metres, or 5 to 10 minutes for high density areas, except for the central city, which is generally between 0, which is the interface of the zone to Beeley Ave, into about 800 metres, effectively capturing the 4 avenues in terms of the walking catchment from the central city. The high density zone, without any specific precincts or overlays, like I said, enables 14 metres in building height. The standards are very similar to medium density by function of applying the MDRS, but there are specific standards that are more lenient within the high density zone, and that really reflects the greater intensification that the zone is intended for. Like I said, there are specific precincts that apply within the high density zone. Within the 4 avenues, the permitted height increases to 6 stories as of right, or 22 metres, and then immediately adjacent to the city centre zone, in the central city residential precinct, 39 metres or about 12 stories is also enabled. Like I said, medium density is applied around those local centre catchments of about 200 metres, except for the likes of Akaroa, given it's not within the urban context of this plan change. The medium density residential zone really is where the MDRS comes into its own. That is really the substantive input in terms of the standards, and so that permits a building height of 11 metres plus 1 metre in roof height, so 12 metres overall. In terms of spatially applying the Policy 3 extent, this high-level picture of the city highlights all of the areas that is captured within Policy 3. So you can see there in all the pink bubbles represents the 30 or so local centre walking catchments that enables the medium density, and then the orange is all of the high density around those larger centres there as well, including some of the other mixed use and other industrial zones that fall within the Policy 3 catchment. In terms of how that relates to the existing plan, what I've tried to show here is all the medium density areas that are for residential zones as well. So we have RMD, the residential medium density zone there, and RSDT, the two-storey equivalent effectively, that exists there as well. So this shows really in contrast to what we have beyond that, what is enabled for medium density within those areas. Just to note as well, there were 4 centres that we originally had discounted in terms of the catchments, being for Littleton, Sumner, Redcliffs and New Brighton, and that is really because of the influence of qualifying matters for those centres. And so, as you'll know, for the likes of New Brighton, Sumner and Redcliffs, there is a very strong influence of coastal qualifying matters and tsunami risk as well. And the IHP have accepted that where there's a 30% overlap or more for specific sites, that the operative zoning holds. And so there are specific areas where that proportion isn't met, that 30% threshold, and so in those instances, medium density would exist. So, for example, the elevated positions of Sumner and Redcliffs would transition from what is operatively as residential hills to being the medium density zone. For Littleton, we had originally interpreted the IHP recommendation to say that where there is a character area that the operative zoning would hold. That has been clarified by the hearings panel to say that it is instead medium density zoning but retain the operative character controls. And so as a result of the Policy 3 recommendation from the hearings panel of 200 metre walking catchment, there are some areas that are very nearby the commercial side of Littleton that would change to being medium density, albeit with the character area overlay as well. In terms of the overall building form, this is a bit of a scale diagram of the city as a result of the full recommendations from the hearings panel. So obviously you can see there within the central city being the largest element, noting that anything above 45 metres is a restricted discretionary activity, so there's no explicit height limit within the central city zone, and then the heights cascade down from there as well. We have shown on there the larger town centre heights with the surrounding high density, as well as the town standard, town centre heights as well. So it's only really the surrounds of those commercial areas that has been decided on today. Like Brent earlier discussed, officers have proposed an alternative recommendation regarding the residential pathways. So the residential pathways recommendation was a response to the High Court precedent about not being more restrictive than status quo development rights. Effectively, the recommendation from the hearings panel seeks to apply all of the operative residential controls where medium or high density zoning is provided, and provide that as a separate pathway for applicants to choose whether or not to apply the operative controls or to apply the medium density or high density controls under PC14. There have been a number of minutes that have canvassed the issue, the latest being introduced very recently and as a result of the time frame that we have, there hasn't been really any opportunity to clarify or amend that any further. And as Brent said, Council's been unable to comment on the application of the precedent, considering the timing of the High Court case in that matter. So, like I said, the panel's recommendation is really to provide an option for people. The concept is really that either are applied, either the operative controls or the PC14 controls. The intent is that there's no choosing between the two. We don't want the ability, or there shouldn't be the ability to be able to select between controls. They should remain independent of each other. However, we have an issue with the latest recommendation from the panel in minute 58. In our view, makes the rules unclear. We consider that the rules are contradictory in of themselves in terms of the framework that's set in minute 58 and also don't reflect previous recommendation. As you may have seen, the Chair's view of this differs, but our review and the legal view also hasn't changed, that they are contradictory. And so as a result, we are putting forward an officer recommendation as an alternative to address the deficiency in our eyes. The officer alternative is fourfold. Firstly is to accept the IHP's recommendation that the pathways remain independent. Second is to reject any provisions that have been put forward that remove that independence or to make that unclear. And then third is to simply adopt existing planned practice in terms of the alternative framework to simplify the approach of duplicate chapters that would otherwise exist with the operative and the PC14 elements. And really also to ensure that the framework reflects a policy 3 only decision, which what today is, noting that the hearings panel recommendations have been drafted as all of PC14 with MDRS included as well. So that brings me to the end of the overview of what Plan Change 14 Policy 3 element is. From what we understand, there are a number of matters to be tabled in terms of changes to recommendations. And so just to note those, Recommendation 19 deals with qualifying matters that are within those Policy 3 contexts. It should be added to have the tsunami management area there as well. As I said, there are those 3 centres that are heavily influenced by qualifying matters for coastal. And so as a result of that, that needs to be captured there. And in 41, this relates to Chapter 7 changes, should also include any other zones decided upon as well to ensure that the framework is consistent with the decision that's been made today. And 53 relates to updates to the high density catchment around Riccarton, and that's to clarify the application of the Policy 3 catchment to not include Matai Street West, and so to remove that element to increase that clarity. And 67 relates to the perimeter block controls alternative that has been put forward, and that is to remove the extension of the catchment, so effectively to hold the 200 metre walking catchment that the panel has recommended around those local centres, and not to extend that for Barrington, Bishopdale and Horswell as well. So that brings me to the end of what we have as table changes, and I'm happy to hand over to you, Mayor, for recommendations.
Okay. You want some questions before we get into the... Okay, Pauline, then Tim?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is so complex. So just when you talk about our amendments today, if an amendment is passed today, does it become operative upon notification?
So in terms of an alternative recommendation, yes. It will have legal effect. So it's as good as, and so it can be implemented through a consenting regime after the notification of decision on the 12th of December. That's right.
12th of December this year?
Correct.
Sorry, just adding to that though. So what that means is that the proposed plan rule in the alternative will be in legal effect from notification, but there will also be an operative district plan. So it doesn't replace the operative district plan, it's taken into account in resource consenting.
Okay, but what I'm finding confusing is that I thought those decisions were going to the minister.
That's right. So effectively, there will be a period, an interim period, that there will be waiting towards the alternative recommendations that are put forward, considering we are making, or council is making, a decision on submissions. However, should the minister then go against that alternative when he responds, then what the minister's put forward will effectively supersede that. So there could, in that scenario, be a period of legal effect, which is then consequently removed if the minister were to go against that in time.
Yeah, but the problem is that some of the amendments were around removal of heritage listings. So by the time the minister was to visit that decision, a particular property could well have been demolished already.
So in terms of the heritage listings, those that exist within the operative plan, that will still hold, so there's no immediate concern around that. Also, in terms of the other matters regarding what's captured in Plan Change 13, like we've discussed, that still has legal effect because of the separate plan change process. So effectively, under the Act, any matter that relates to heritage of a plan change has effect effectively as soon as it is notified, and so those areas that overlap with Plan Change 13, there is no concern there in terms of removing the heritage control. Plan Change 13 still ensures that that heritage control remains.
Thank you. And I've got 3 quick questions and maybe 4, but I just think it's it is important for our ratepayers to do a wee bit of history, but in clarification. So Brent, could you just clarify judicial review? So we've met before and people have said, oh look, we're going to take the council to just judicial review, etc. Can you just explain very quickly and simply the process of judicial review? Because it's something that I've been asked by ratepayers all the time.
Sure. So judicial review means that someone's applied to the High Court and has asked the High Court to have the High Court judge to review the council's decision making, and that can apply to any council decision making in which the council has exercised a sort of quasi-judicial judgment itself. And what the High Court is reviewing is whether there was a fundamental flaw or error in the way the council made the decision. So the High Court doesn't substitute its own view on the merits of whatever the council decided on for the council view. But what the High Court judge does do is look at whether the council took into account all relevant considerations, whether the council disregarded all irrelevant considerations, whether the council decision, whether there was any sort of fundamental error of law in the council's decision making, or whether the council decision was one that no reasonable decision maker could have made in the circumstances. So it's a very high level judicial review of the way the council made its decision. But as I say, if the issue is solely about whether the council was right, for example, to accept an IHP recommendation, that's a decision on the merits, and the High Court doesn't involve itself in that. Now, if the High Court finds that there was a reviewable error in the council decision making, the High Court has 2 options. The one that it uses most is to send the matter back to the council, to say to the council, you made an error in that, make the decision again and make it right this time. So that's what the High Court would usually do. Sometimes the High Court would substitute its own decision for that of the council, but that's pretty rare.
Thank you. The second one, and probably more for Mark or Ike, the whole process of this was started with a bipartisan agreement between both main parties, wasn't it, about intensification and trying to bring down house prices through that. Would that be a fair statement?
Well, that's I'll answer that, Ike. That's where the legislation came from in the first place. That the change to the RMA that introduced the requirement to have this sort of plan change came through a bipartisan agreement, but that subsequently fell apart, as you know.
Cool. Thank you very much. And
Just worth noting in terms of the policy 3 element that we're deciding on today, that has a genesis from 2016. So 2016 was the original National Policy Statement for Urban Development Capacity, and that was consequently changed in 2020 to include this policy 3 element. And so like Brent said, the Act was then changed thereafter to introduce the streamlined planning process as well as the MDRS, and effectively meld those two together to have the policy 3 element from the 2020 NPSUD as well as the intensification element from the MDRS.
thank you very much. And just saying that no major parties actually discussed at any point foreign ownership and restricting that, which would actually bring down the prices. Nothing that's been done has actually brought down the house prices to date. So thank you.
Yanni?
Thank you. I'm just struggling to understand this whole residential pathways thing, right? Can you just give me a practical example? If you're a developer or someone applying for a resource consent, can you just talk me through what would happen with the residential pathways versus without it? Can you just be clear? Like, someone comes to council, says, "I want to build, 10 units under the district plan." How does the residential pathways work? I'm still struggling to understand what that concept is.
Sure. So without the pathways, simply the applicant would assess the rules against the relative zone. And so it's as per it is today. With the pathways, there's a choice. And so the rules that have been drafted that discuss the pathways say that without stating an intent to use the operative framework, that the zone rules apply. And so we've intended, and the IHP have accepted, to make it as simple as possible, that if someone doesn't state their intent to use a pathway, it's easy. It simply applies medium or high density accordingly. Where it changes is that if an applicant feels that the operative framework, for whatever reason, is more amenable to the development that they want to do, then they can elect to use the operative zoning that existed before Plan Change 14. So say, for example, you had a site and you are under Plan Change 14 medium density zone, and under the operative you are residential suburban density transition, then you could say, look, I think that the provisions are more lenient for the residential density transition, the operative framework, and I want to elect to use those, and so the entirety of that framework would apply. Where we have sought to have clarity is around making sure that they are treated in isolation, because they are a package of rules intended to deliver an outcome together. And so we don't want those rules to pick and mix together, and that's why the independence of those frameworks is so important.
Right. So basically, the person that's developing gets to choose the most lenient pathway that they see to meet their development, so they can have the lesser amount of rules effectively, and we're giving people the option to do that. Is that the takeaway?
That's the fundamental of the recommendation from the hearings panel, that an applicant can choose which way they want to go, yes.
And why is this an issue?
Well, I guess in terms of where it's come from, its genesis is about making sure that any provisions that are put forward aren't more restrictive than the status quo. So as part of Plan Change 14, there are additional ancillary controls such as fencing, placement of outdoor ventilation units and the like that are new. And so by their very nature, they are more restrictive than the status quo. So the hearings panel felt that it was necessary and simplest really to provide an entire framework that was separate, and so applicants can choose to use the operative or the Plan Change 14 route. Where it's become an issue in the most recent minute is that, in our view, those provisions that seek to maintain the independence of those two pathways has been diluted. And so it makes it unclear about how an applicant can actually go through the process of independently providing those pathways and ensuring that there isn't a pick and mix scenario between the two.
So, well, like, just to be really clear, like, if we, I just don't understand, like, given that we've got this kind of two different plans now for developers, why wouldn't we just review the entire district plan and just have one plan that people know what the rules are?
I entirely agree that could be an option post Plan Change 14, but the very problem is that this is a result of the function of the legislation to introduce a streamlined planning process. So it's far more fickle than a standard plan change
So a
process.
streamlined process has made it more complicated, more expensive, takes more resources and time to sort, basically.
It's more specific about what's in and out of scope. Simple as that. And so it can't do a full district plan review. That's a separate full Schedule 1 plan change.
Thank you.
Can you
Thank
just,
you, Yannick.
the other question I just had was around the heritage. So my understanding, and I've put an amendment that we defer the heritage considerations until PC 13. So I think the advice that I've had back from you is we vote against adding that to the scope of this. Is that correct? Or do we have to reject all the hearing panel's recommendations on heritage and character overlays? Can you just give me some clarity on that? There's been a lot of public interest in what's happening with heritage and character, and I'd just like to be really clear around the decisions that we can make today and the ones that we can't.
Yep. So we must make a decision on all of those heritage matters that fall within a Policy 3 context. It's as simple as that. So you must decide either to accept the IHP recommendation or to reject the IHP recommendation with an alternative. And for those matters that overlap with Plan Change 13, what we're saying is that really regardless of the decision that gets made today, in terms of those overlap, Plan Change 13 still is a process that will have legal effect and can consider those matters. And so there's like Brent said, there's a report coming later on in the month in terms of those matters that overlap regarding residential heritage areas and whether or not there is an intent to withdraw. So what we have said is that we would like elected members to state their reasonings in terms of residential heritage areas, in terms of what you're intending with the vote today to accept or reject hearing panel's recommendations.
Right. And
Work. Enough. We are getting out of control here. We're starting to bore on into every separate recommendation. There will be an opportunity to ask questions on the individual recommendations, specific recs, as we go forward. And here we are starting to get into them already, and we haven't even got off the first page. If the next 5 questions are just general questions on it, and just bear in mind, as we get to the recommendations, 55, 65, whatever it is down the track, we can ask these questions, tighter questions now of them. So, Aaron.
Feel free to cut me off, Mr. Mayor.
Anytime you like.
So with the removal of the coastal areas, why is that? I would have thought now would be a good time to be adding height. Like most of the world that has flooding zones, tsunami areas, it's all parking underneath. So you put your 2-story house on top of your parking, and then you can stay in your house during a tsunami and no one dies.
The recommendation from the hearings panel regarding those sites that have that sufficient overlap is to retain the operative district plan controls. And a key reason for that is that the hearings panel recognise that council intends to have a separate plan change process, Plan Change 12, which will consider all of the controls in its fulsome for those areas. And so the hearings panel, in terms of its recommendations for 14, has accepted that this is a holding pattern before Plan Change 12. Plan Change 12 is the real opportunity to change those provisions in their fulsome.
Right. Thank you. Andre?
Thank you. Do you have any indication on what sort of time frame we'd expect to get a decision from the Minister? From my quick Google, it looks like it was about 6 weeks in Wellington. We've got a Christmas period coming up.
Yeah, so my guess, and there's no indication from the Ministry, would be March sometime. There is work that we as officers need to do to ensure that the package of material that we're providing to the Minister is complete.
Yes.
We've already received the template from the Ministry in terms of work that's required. Our intention very much is to have that submitted by the end of this year, and so it's fresh for the Ministry and the Minister to consider in the new year. And so, yeah, best indication, simple guess it is March, but around that time. There is a duty really to consider it as quickly as possible, but these are complex.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, mate. Victoria?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My question is supplementary to Councillor Scandrett and Councillor Johansson. It's in respect of the judicial review and the residential heritage. So you have asked us to state our reasoning when we vote on that matter. And I'm seeking to understand that if we don't, or if we can't, does that open us up for judicial review? And I suppose the second part of that, is it a reason that we have to agree all together as the council's view, and what happens if everybody have different reasons as to why they voted one way or another, and how does that impact on the likelihood of judicial review? Can you help me understand that, please?
A little bit, maybe not a lot. So when I was talking about the expressing reasons for your decision today on PC 14, I was putting myself in the shoes of the council officers who are writing a report to you coming to the next council meeting, or I think it's on the 11th of December, writing a report on Plan Change 13. You see, what that report's going to be doing is making a recommendation to you based on what officers see as being the feeling around the table, if you like, about whether the council wants to continue with residential heritage areas in PC 13 or not. So when I was talking about the reasons for your decision, I was talking principally about that kind of pragmatic aspect of it that I described before. So just to recap that again, the IHP is recommending, and I'll concentrate on residential heritage areas. The IHP recommends that residential heritage areas not be kept in Plan Change 14. Okay. If the council accepts that recommendation on the basis that it accepts the IHP's reasoning that the evidence didn't really stack up in PC 14 to justify those residential heritage areas, if the council says that today, then staff know that you're still intending to continue with residential heritage areas in PC 13. And we'll be able to take that on board when the staff are preparing that report to come to a council meeting next week. So in terms
are we inherently then suggesting to you that we support it and we'd like it in Plan Change 13, but we want you to beef up the evidence?
Yeah, it would be, yeah.
Okay, Tyler, please.
This is in regards to the heritage part, and I'm happy to move it across, but I just want to make sure I don't get surprised by the alternative recommendation that Yanni's going to be pushing forward. But it's in regards to the timing of pushing the heritage provision from here to PC 13, particularly relating to Antonio Hall. In relation to the Carter Group's buildings, such as the Blue Cottage and the one just outside council, the Harley Chambers, what's the difference between both of those levers? So we've moved to take away the heritage provisions for those, but now this is sitting differently. I'm just trying to understand or gain scope of what the difference is between the two. And if this wasn't to pass today, what alternative levers are there for Antonio Hall, etc.?
So on the 18th of September, you made a decision to remove Harley Chambers, Blue Cottage from the schedule of heritage items in the district plan. The effect of that was to remove the listing. In respect of the Blue Cottage, as an example, on the corner of Armagh and Montreal, in addition to its listing in a schedule, which you've removed, it's also within a residential heritage area. residential heritage areas are a matter you have not decided yet, and which, in the context of today, you'll decide in the context of Plan Change 14 whether to accept or reject the hearings panel's recommendation on that. Regardless of that recommendation, residential heritage areas would then also be subject to a decision in the context of Plan Change 13 because they're still alive for a different process to this, regardless of what you decide today. So you can't make a decision on residential heritage areas in only one context. You need to make a decision on Plan Change 14 in respect of residential heritage areas, but also a second decision in the context of Plan Change 13.
Okay, so residential heritage areas are particularly around Pico Shands, which is double layered in character and heritage. Am I right in thinking that?
That's correct. There's 11 residential heritage areas across the city proposed, 4 of which are within Policy 3 areas. So today, the focus of your decision is on the Policy 3 areas and making a decision on whether to accept or reject the panel's recommendations on residential heritage areas being retained. In doing so, as Brent said, a clear indication of your reasoning for that so that we can give advice come the 11th of December on whether you retain residential heritage areas within Plan Change 13 as well or
Cool.
not.
Sweet. I got those reasons. Thanks.
Yep, it's very, and they're all good questions, they're very good answers. And lastly, Mel, and then we'll get into it.
The topic is. If we decide to accept the recommendation to not have residential heritage areas in Policy 3, and then it's live later, in the interim time from the 12th of December up to when we make the decision on PC 13, if we decide to carry it on, what will the heritage? I'm confused myself now, but I want to know what the actual state of each in those heritage areas. Will those heritage things apply either way we make a decision? Is that I'm confused about it. So either whatever decision we make today, it'll still be heritage until we make a decision to take it out of PC 13. Is that right?
Yeah, the rule in Plan Change 13, the rules took effect from notification when we invited submissions, and will continue to take effect until you make any decision to withdraw those rules or not.
Yeah, but that's different to the heritage listings like Antonio Hall. So if we decide today to accept the panel's recommendation to take it out, does that mean it's now out?
Correct.
Right, so okay. And then we couldn't really bring it back through PC. We couldn't change it at all later. Right. Okay. Cool.
So thank you very much. Right. Thanks very much for that. And just going back onto the small modifications that some of the councillors have made to their recommendations, the ones you said, the changes that you brought up. Yep, those. Okay, so that's all sorted. I don't know if this is the right time to bring this up, but there's one that was floating around and I didn't know whether it was in there or not, but it's number 55 is I thought that Fendleton Village Local Centre could or would be part of that. Is that too late to do that? I've talked the mover and seconder, but it's up to you guys to see if it can be put in. So it's just something to think about. Don't have to tell me now. I'm just go away and think.
Yeah, I mean, like we've said earlier, our preferences for any modification of alternatives that come today or any new alternatives that they are considered after staff have done the work to align those submission points.
Okay, yep.
And so that could be, depending on how timing goes, either later today or tomorrow.
Yep.
Our preferences for tomorrow, so there's time to do that work.
Okay, no, I'll just throw it out there. Thank you very much. Right. We are now... Not everyone's got that. Yeah, everyone's got this, haven't they? Yeah, good. We're motoring through it. We're up to page 2. I'm serious. No, they're all good questions. Right, so scope and qualifying matters. Number 20, number 1 to 21, I'm moving it. The Deputy Mayor is seconding it. So, as you know, that we told the other day, we're chopping them up into 4 different blocks. Recommendations 1 to 4, which is on page 2 to 3 of your table. Has anyone got any questions on those ones? And just because no one's talking doesn't mean to say you have to. And then I'll put the next group. Yanni. It's just for Rex 1 to 4, mate.
Right. Okay. Cool. So that's just these. Oh yeah. Cool. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the page.
Yep,
So
page 2 and 3.
yeah. Cool. So in terms of 4, can I just check? Is this the one around 4K that we basically, if we're concerned about the heritage, doing more heritage that's out of that's relevant to PT13? This is where we do that under 4K.
Yeah, so in 4K, Roman numeral 3 and 5, those are aspects that are beyond policy 3 catchment in terms of what's being considered.
And
2 as well in terms of Dewsbury Lane. So Councillor McDonald's alternative regarding Dewsbury Lane is outside of policy 3 catchment. Pico Shan residential heritage area and the character area from Councillor Harrison Hunt's recommendation and extension, if you will, is also beyond policy 3 area, and then 5 as well for Antonio Hall at 265 Rickerton Road. So in those respects, council's using its discretion to extend the minimum of what's been decided.
And also, just to be clear, the special purpose Otakaro Avon River Corridor, which is on page 3, but part of the 4, it's 4S.
Yep.
That's also out of, sorry, I forget the phrase you used, but that's got a private plan change that can be dealing with it. Doesn't need to be dealt with as part of this. And so therefore, the way to do that is to reject it here.
That remains to be seen. The private plan change process has, because of the overlap in terms of what had been identified and what we notified with plan change 14, sought to go through the plan change 14 route. And so as a result of that, the 2-year time frame that is required for a plan change to be resolved from the date of notification under the Act has lapsed. And so there isn't the ability through that private plan change to continue without seeking leave from the ministry, and they're fully entitled to consider that and reject that application because the time frame has lapsed for that private plan change.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, please.
Thanks. Thanks for making the change to my alternate, but I think that 4K1 now needs 3 words taken out of it. Barrington, Bishopdale and Horswell. Well, 4 words. So we leave city centre.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah. So on that recommendation, yeah. 4K1. So
And then I think also in that respect, the reference to recommendation 67 in that part can be taken out as well.
yeah, because that's what that was from.
Yep.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Mark.
Thank you. Just want to make sure that my conflict on 4K4 Rickett and Bush interface is noted, and I'll step back from that particular clause.
All right, okay, yep, thank you. Right, okay, no more questions on that little grouping. We'll go Rex 5 to 11. They're on page 4 of your song sheet. Any questions there? No, that's good. Okay, the next one's Rex 12 to 16 on page 5. Yanni.
Sorry, just to get clarity that these ones are ones that have to be considered today in terms of heritage or character overlay, apart from 12E.
Yeah, so that's the nuance. So in terms of E, that's not required to be considered. So the alternative that regards sorry, there is an alternative for that because effectively the OHP's recommendation is to reject the residential heritage areas and so this is to include that as part of the consideration in terms of that specific residential heritage area. Pico Shan, like I said, is beyond policy 3, so we're applying our discretion to extend that. The ones that we must consider are A to D. So E, we're using our discretion to extend that.
Yeah, and just it's just, I know there's lots of information, but effectively, because we don't have the panel's recommendations in front on this sheet, are you able just to clarify the panel's recommendations for the Inner City West and Chester Street East are to do what?
For all of them is to reject the application of the residential heritage area.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the public understanding the decision making, should it not be more specific when we're passing these resolutions so people know exactly what's being done? Like if you just read that, you as a member of the public, you would have no idea that it's rejecting or cancelling the residential heritage areas.
So we've sought to include the link to the recommendations at the top, and so there's a hyperlink to the page where it's at. The reason that we've done it this way is because if we were to detail what the recommendations are, it would be quite unwieldy, because some of the recommendations are quite specific, and so this is the way that we've done it to simplify that really at the end of the day.
Right.
So we don't need to say, like, I get it, we don't need to say we're removing the residential heritage area for these two, but or these 5, but it's effectively what we're doing, and someone has to go on a link on a website, it's a hyperlink.
Well, you do, because you're the decision maker.
Yeah, we do. I'm just talking about the public though. When they read this document, when
Sure.
the minutes come out, how are they going to understand the decision that we've made?
Who's reading it?
Well, the council can publish publicity material and explanatory material as well.
Okay, right. We'll now move on to the last wee grouping, Rec 17 to 21, which is on page 6. Mel, you got your hand up? Or are you just scratching your ear? Okay. Right. There's an update on recommendation number 19. It's the one, the guys have it, L?
Yeah.
Yeah, accepts the panel's recommendation on tsunami management area.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yanni.
Just to clarify that the panel's recommendation on the radio communications pathways qualifying matter is to enable the radio communications pathways to be blocked by development, and if we
Incorrect.
sorry, okay, yeah, can you just clarify, because I thought there was an amendment to remove this. So
So the hearings panel changed its position from what it originally had. So we sought through multiple clarifications to understand the rationale for the initial rejection of the qualifying matter. And several weeks ago, the hearings panel came back and accepted the rationale that it should be a qualifying matter. So now, as a result of applying the IHP's recommendation, should any building enter into that pathway, they will require resource consent to do so. They cannot block the pathway.
And so did they just have a change of mind, or, I mean, what happened? Because they were pretty adamant when we got briefed on it last time that it shouldn't be a qualifying matter.
Yeah, so fundamentally the position was around scope rather than merit. They absolutely agreed with the merit. It was, again, the difficulty of the ISPP process and whether or not it was a policy 3 consideration. And so we helped to understand what that was like. The Ministry of Justice also was in correspondence with us, which we forwarded to the hearings panel. And as a result of that, they understood that it could be considered as part of the scope, and they changed their position accordingly.
And does it have any wider implications on other things that we've argued that aren't in scope that they've added?
There are a few things that they've changed their tune on through the consequential minutes and the like after the recommendations were changed. They're more points of clarity than anything. But yeah, this is one of the examples where the whole qualifying matter has come in back again.
And was that again based on the Waikanae that we can't do anything that's any more restrictive than what we've currently got? That's basically the logic.
In terms of the radio pathways, yeah, that was part of the consideration. It was more along the lines of policy 3 directs this kind of height, and the heights that are being managed are beyond that. So I'm simplifying a lot, but in a nutshell, that's what the recommendation was, or the reasoning for the recommendation to initially reject it.
In respect of Waikanae, they changed their recommendation, resulted in a change to the rules such that it didn't breach the Waikanae case any longer. So that was addressed through their revised recommendation.
Yeah, so to be clear, they didn't accept the rule framework that council had recommended. They recommended an alternative framework, so like Mark said, to address the Waikanae issue.
Beautiful. Pauline, please.
Thank you. Can you please explain 19K, what the recommendation is?
Certainly.
Thanks.
So 19K relates to the residential character areas that exist within Policy 3. And so the ones that are listed there, like I've said, Littleton is to accept the character area qualifying matter, and so that would be retained. There's some smaller nuance to some sites that don't meet the criteria, but it is largely retained in terms of a qualifying matter. However, the likes of Ranfurly, Beverley and Clifton, the recommendation is to remove those. For Clifton, it regards the Clifton area and reflects the change that's happened post-earthquake in terms of those buildings being removed, and so it doesn't really reflect the characteristics that with the rationale for its original intention when the district plan came in. And for Ranfurly and Beverley, those exist within high density context, and so the hearings panel considered that the balance of Policy 3 in terms of high density effectively was more superior than retaining character areas in those streets.
Thank you.
So what, in a process thing, if one wanted to vote against that one, you can just put it separately, can ask, but then, so for me, I don't agree with the Ranfurly or Beverley, but I agree with Clifton and Littleton, so how do we manage that? Or just vote against the whole thing? I mean, the whole K.
So if you'd like, I can note that your vote against a specific aspect of that recommendation be recorded. Now, if too many of the elected members want, these two areas split out, then I would prefer to split the recommendation into.
Okay, so just let you know how we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Mel? No, you're right. Okay, so we've...
So that follows on from my question the other day. So just to be clear, we are able to vote on certain parts of recommendations, and splits will be. Yes.
You certainly note them.
Noting them will be fine.
Yes. So the way that the minutes are set up and structured for the elected members is now we're going to vote in the blocks that you have on your sheets and that we've just addressed the questions on. So 1 through 4, 5 through 11, etc. So if you want any aspect of that particular part of the recommendation put separate, if there's enough of you that would like your vote recorded against that, that can be done. Alternatively, if it's just 1 or 2 of you who'd like to note that you are voting against a certain component of the recommendation, I can note that down and the minutes will reflect that.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
Righto. So scope and qualifying matters. We are as Recs 1 to 21. We're going to go into debate if it's necessary. Now, do you want me to just go around the table and you'll say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, or how do we want to do it? Usual? Do the usual? Righto. Who would like to debate Recs 1 to 21?
No thanks.
Right. Okay. Oh, Mel, yeah.
I'm probably going to agree with most of it, but I will vote against 12 and 13, considering the residential heritage areas will remain, and I think we should consider them when we consider PC 13. So that's probably my main point.
Okay, so now, Katie, just so I'm on the right track, I'm putting the first one.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the conclusion of the debate.
Yeah. Yanni, sorry, did you have another question?
Debate.
Oh, sorry, it's in debate. No, that's right. Oh, sorry, debate. Sorry.
Cool.
I'm trying to get ahead of myself to the next group.
Yeah, I mean, my starting point is that we should actually do the heritage and through that plan change 13. And I do feel that it's inherently difficult for a community to follow the process when things get brought in ahead of the other plan change that we were doing. In particular, for this section, I am concerned and will be voting against the incorporation of the additional resolutions around the character areas and the heritage listings, and also the significant trees. And I also will be, so I will be voting against 12 and 13, and also 14G. I'd also like to vote against the Avon River Corridor Zone being done as part of this process. That was a really sensitive site because it was former residential land. There was a private plan change process, and I believe that that is the better process that should be used in terms of addressing those issues with the community being able to clearly be involved in the process. So for me, the kind of overriding principle is the more that we do as a city in terms of our district planning for our community, the better, rather than allowing the independent hearing panel to do effectively change almost our entire district plan, you know, and to do things outside of what the government intended. So that's my position. And yeah, thanks.
Fair enough. Tyler.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly address two things, which is Pico Shands and Antonio Hall. And the reasoning why I put that sitting outside the Policy 3 area is because it actually promotes housing in the area that is most suited to it. In the 1950s, the Labour government pushed forward a state housing campaign in the Pico Shands area, particularly Harrington, and that sits just outside of Matipo Street, which is HRZ at the moment, or soon, potentially soon to be, depending on how this council goes. And with Pico Shands, they're actually areas that need housing. They are single glazed, two-storey homes that are more than 50 years old, which need updating. The second one is Antonio Hall, which is built with a great bit of history. It's more than 100 years old. Thomas Kincaid, who was an old city councillor for that area, was living there too, and he was buried at St. Peter's Church. So I'm really, really sad to have to ask for this, but there is needs within the community that need to be addressed, particularly with student housing and housing for those that need it in the rental market. Riccarton is the highest rented ward in the city, and it'll probably continue to be with UC continuing to grow. So that's why I had to try and push for Antonio Hall and Pico Shands to be taken off the heritage listing. And the time is now. The time is not in a few months or in a few years' time. The student rate's going to continue to go up, and these are the perfect spots for them, particularly around that area of Church Corner and the university. Kia ora.
Thank you. Any other debate? No, righto. So I'll put them all separately. Okay. So recommendations 1 to 4. We have a mover and seconder on all of these, Pauline and I. So recommendations 1 to 4. I'll put that. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Yanni got that. Yep.
I mean, how do you want to do it? Are you going to? You just want us to?
It's already written into the minutes, man.
Yes, sir. I have your vote to be recorded against recommendations, so that's 4K, 2, 3, and 5.
Yeah. 2, 3, 5. Yep. And S. Yep. Cool. Great. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Right.
I'm finding it a little bit confusing because the recommendations K will be voting on separately their amendments.
You're talking about Antonio Hall, for argument's sake.
Well, yeah, and Dewsbury Lane and Pico.
It's just
And just to be clear, like, my vote wasn't against the first 3. It was just that you're doing it in a block. So I'm just trying to make sure that the ones I am against, we can have recorded. So
Yeah, we're not putting Recs 1, 2, 3, 4 separately. It's just a block, okay?
But it does say subject to alternate
Yes,
recommendation.
so we don't have to bother. Yeah.
Okay. So
Thank you.
that Recs 1 to 4 is carried. Thank you very much. Recommendations 5 to 11. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Recs 12 to 16, all those in favour? Aye. Against? Yep. Yep, so we've got Yanni and Mel who are...
And me, I'm opposed to 13 and 14 as well.
Right. Oh, totally the whole thing? 12 and 13?
Okay, sorry. For recommendation 12, can I get hands raised for against, please? That's Councillor Coker, Johansson,
Pauline.
McClellan,
Oh, yeah, sorry. Sleep.
and Councillor Deputy Mayor Cotter.
And Yanni was 14.
Yes. Recommendation 13, any hands against? Thank you. Recommendation 14, any votes against? Sorry, Councillor Johansson, that was a vote against 14?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you. I'll make that note. Recommendation 15, any votes against? Hands, please. Recommendation 16, any votes against?
No problem. Okay, so that's carried. Thank you very much. And the last one in this group, Rec 17 to 21. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Thank you. That is carried. We might have some morning tea for 15. Okay, so what have we got? Yeah, 11:15, please.